As the war in Ukraine enters a decisive phase on the battlefield this week, European leaders stepped up their rhetoric a notch, with one comment in particular prompting a furious response from the Kremlin and some potentially ominous statements from Russian President Vladimir Putin. During a wide-ranging interview with the Flemish newspaper De Morgen, Belgian Minister of Defense and Foreign Trade Theo Francken stated that if Russia struck Brussels with missiles, the response would be decisive. To wit, "We'd flatten Moscow." This statement made headlines across Europe, and the reaction to it compelled Francken to clarify his comments on X. So let's take a closer look at what he actually said, Moscow's reaction, and what it all means for the future of the war. The Flemish words used by Francken to describe NATO's response to a Russian missile attack on Brussels translate as, "We'll wipe it from the face of the earth." However, both Google Translate and DeepL translate this as, "We'd flatten Moscow." Either way, you can see where the controversy might emerge, no matter which translation you use. Francken was commenting in response to a question about whether he feared that Putin might one day launch a non-nuclear missile at Brussels. "No," he replied, "because that would hit the heart of NATO, and then we would flatten Moscow, or again, wipe it from the face of the earth, whichever you prefer." The interviewer, Ralf Leekens, pressed him on the point, asking, "Are you sure that Trump will respect Article 5 of the NATO treaty?" referring to President Donald Trump. Francken seemed to become annoyed. "Of course, the bias against the American government is so great in Europe. Unbelievable. Why wouldn't he?" Leekens then asked about comments made by Trump in June this year at the NATO summit when he was asked whether the US would honor its commitments under Article 5 to join the fight if European NATO members were attacked. Trump reportedly replied, "It depends on your definition. There are many definitions of Article 5. Trump does have a point. The wording of the clause does leave room for maneuver. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area," the article states. That statement leaves plenty of wiggle room for nations to opt out of direct military involvement should they so desire. However, Francken scoffs at the idea that the US wouldn't join NATO in responding to a Russian strike on Brussels with overwhelming military force. "Oh, President Trump often makes those strange little remarks," he replied. "You have to see through them. He literally said that America will continue to support its NATO allies 100%. A cruise missile on Brussels? That's a no-brainer, whatever definition you use. Putin won't do that either." He was referring to comments made earlier in the interview in response to a question about whether the supply of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would represent the dramatic tipping point that the Kremlin claimed it would. Francken dismissed the notion. "Putin said the same thing when Finland and Sweden joined NATO, when we supplied tanks, missiles, F-16s. The lesson is that we must allow ourselves to be threatened. In the beginning, we only dared to fight back in Ukraine out of fear of Putin's reaction. In doing so, we only prolonged the war because a lot of supply lines run through Russia. You have to attack them, as we are finally doing now. That was also a red line for Putin, but what did he do? Nothing. He knows that if he uses nuclear weapons, they will wipe Moscow off the map. Then the end of the world will be near." Well, it's certainly true that Russia threatened escalation up to and including the use of nuclear weapons in response to each of the escalations listed by Francken. However, Russia has upped the ante to an extent after some of them. The Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy and gas facilities that have left much of the country facing rolling blackouts and gas disruptions only began after Ukraine attacked the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland in October 2022. These attacks have intensified during the summer of 2025, in direct response to Ukraine's increasing targeting of Russian oil refineries during the same period. Russia also raised the stakes, at least in Russian minds, after the US and UK authorized Ukraine to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, respectively, to strike military targets within Russian territory in November 2024. Ukraine almost immediately obliged, striking an armament depot in Russia's Bryansk region on November 9th. In response, Russia launched the Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro for the first time on November 21st. The missile, or rather missiles, struck Pivdenmash, also known as Yuzhmash, a major Ukrainian defense enterprise in the city long engaged in missile and rocket production. The move was largely seen as a warning in the West, rather than a kinetic escalation per se. Footage from the strike looks like something from an action movie. 6 barrages of 6 missiles moving at extreme speeds pass through the clouds and strike the same area within seconds. Satellite imagery of the site later showed what appeared to be minimal damage, besides some deep-looking holes in the roof of the Enterprise, which dovetails with the fact that no explosions seem to follow the missile's impact. Putin claimed that the missile strike had been a test without warheads in place, which seems plausible given the evidence. Russia also claimed that the missiles move at speeds of up to Mach 10, that's 7,672 miles per hour, making it impossible to bring down with NATO air defenses like the MIM-104 Patriot system. And even without a warhead, the missile itself reached temperatures of 4,000 degrees Celsius. If that's true, the Oreshnik, which means hazelnut tree, is a kind of man-made meteor and would burn straight through layers of fortified concrete without any need for an explosion, as Putin claims. Perhaps tellingly, no footage of the floors of the plant directly below the strike has ever been made public. If these characteristics turn out to be true, a single Oreshnik multi-missile tipped with large warheads could conceivably cause as much damage as a tactical nuclear weapon, but without the consequent radiation. However, multiple Western analysts have expressed doubts about whether the missile is anywhere near as powerful or intimidating as Putin claims. Nonetheless, in June, Putin announced that serial production of the latest Oreshnik system was underway and may also be deployed in Belarus. On October 28th, the day after Francken's interview was published, there was more news about the Oreshnik. Natalia Eismont, spokesperson for the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, announced that Belarus would be deploying Russia's new Oreshnik intermediate-range hypersonic missile system in December, with preparations for deployment nearing completion. It's not the only news about advanced Russian weaponry that has emerged since the interview, as we'll discover later. Certainly, besides his dismissal of the threat of Russian missile strikes on Brussels due to fear of NATO's response, Francken is not one of those who dismiss Russia's military as what Trump mockingly called a paper tiger. The interviewer quizzes him on whether he thinks NATO members' commitment to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP within the next decade is absurd, to which he disagrees. The standard is 3.5% for defense and 1.5% for investments in infrastructure and resilience. That's not excessive. We are already spending 2% on defense and 1.5% on investments, but we have 10 years to scale that up. Given that NATO already has numerical superiority over Russia in terms of weapon systems, Francken was asked how much more NATO would need. He dismisses the premise that NATO holds such an advantage. That's not true. The Russians have increased their capabilities. Their war economy produces 4 times more ammunition than the entire NATO combined. You can't compare budgets either, because the Russians can buy much more than we can with the same amount of money. The last point is precisely why ever more economists are using GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP, to estimate the size of nations' economies and defense spending, rather than the traditional nominal GDP. The PPP model tracks money flows in the currency in which they were transacted, rather than in US dollars. Ranked by nominal GDP, Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world, far behind the US, at $2.174 trillion in 2024. Ranked by PPP-adjusted GDP, Russia ranks as the 4th largest economy globally, with an estimated $6.909 trillion in 2024. People who claim that we should not be afraid of the Russians are seriously mistaken. They are a geopolitical superpower with a strong army and an enormous fighting spirit. They won in Chechnya, they dominated the war in Syria for 10 years, and they are active on many fronts in Africa. Europe does not even have a central command. Apart from a few Eurocorps troops in Strasbourg, we have nothing that can be immediately deployed in combat. Then Francken makes arguably the most controversial statement of the entire interview. Likens pushed back against Francken, talking up Russia's military capabilities, stating, "But in Ukraine, the Russians are not getting through." Francken counters with, "Because they are fighting the whole of the West. The Ukrainians are fighting with our weapons, ammunition and money. Otherwise they would have been overwhelmed long ago." It's a point that Putin and a host of other Russian officials have used repeatedly to justify both the necessity for the war and Russia's painstaking progress on the ground. That said, despite more than $280 billion that has been provided to Ukraine by Western donors since 2022, Francken does not believe that the support of the entire West is sufficient to beat Russia militarily in Ukraine. "We won't be able to bring the Russians to their knees militarily unless we send hundreds of thousands of European troops," he says, adding subtly, "I could always propose that in Parliament, but there will be little enthusiasm for it." Instead, he believes that over time, the way to break Russia is through economic means. "We must try to break Russia economically. We have already succeeded in doing so 3 times in the past 100 years. That means expanding economic sanctions and drying up their oil and gas revenues, because that is the engine of their war economy. In recent months, Ukraine has hit a quarter of Russia's oil refineries with deep strikes," Francken said. However, he doesn't believe that the financial or so-called kinetic sanctions unleashed by Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy facilities to date are close to accomplishing that objective. "According to reports I'm receiving from Moscow," Francken said, "the price at the pump has risen by 10%, but otherwise it's been business as usual there." pensions are still being paid, cafes and shops are open, and everyday soldiers' mothers appear on state television to say how proud they are of their sons that died for their country. Don't underestimate that brainwashing. I don't believe the Russian economy will collapse next year, but we must keep up the pressure on them. He also doesn't believe that NATO states are under any threat of a Russian invasion, not even in the Baltic states. This is no small part due to NATO's superiority in the air, particularly with respect to its F-35 fighter jets. Soon we will have 600 F-35s in Europe. The Russians are afraid of them because they cannot see them, he said. However, Francken is a firm proponent of rapidly ramping up European domestic security arrangements in case of asymmetrical attacks, such as, for example, a Russian attack on the electricity grid. I don't believe in a nuclear war that would suddenly turn our lives into a dystopian film, he says. But if the Russians shut down our electricity grid for a few hours or days, I don't want to have to go to the shops. During the pandemic, toilet paper was sold out. In such a situation, I can't wait until stocks are replenished. That's why he said he keeps an emergency kit at home, including bottled water, tinned food, a battery-powered radio, a torch, candles. That will keep me going for a few weeks. All things considered, Francken comes across as a rational and reasonable fellow, and yet his comments provoked a distinctly nose-out-of-joint reaction from the Kremlin. The Russian embassy in Belgium posted on its Telegram channel the defiant and irresponsible statements of one of the main Belgian hawks, with forecasts of Russian missile attacks on Brussels and threats to erase Moscow from the map of the world, would hardly deserve our attention due to their absolute abnormality and complete isolation from reality. As they say, insanity was getting stronger. As we've laid out, that's not really what he said at all, underlining the high state of tension in which Francken's interview was published. Francken has subsequently felt compelled to calm nerves. A lot of fuss about this classic clickbait title, but you can only understand the statement if you read the entire interview, he posted on X, with a link to the full text. However, in addition to the sulky Russian embassy response, further escalatory statements also emerged from Russia in the aftermath of the interview. It's not clear whether the timing of these is coincidental or further fallout from Francken's words. The day before Francken's interview on October 26th, Russia apparently successfully tested its new Burevestnik missile. Like the Oreshnik, it has the potential to reshape the security equation across Europe. The Oreshnik is believed to have a range of 310 to 3,400 miles, placing most of Europe within its reach. However, the Burevestnik threatens anywhere on the planet, including the continental US. It's nuclear-armed, which is alarming enough, but it's also nuclear-powered, a world-first modern nuclear-powered missile. The Burevestnik, also known as SSC-X9 Skyfall, is named for the storm petrel, a bird that some believe foreshadows a storm. Because it runs on nuclear power, it can fly for much longer than other missiles can, remaining in the air for 15 hours and traveling 8,700 miles in the latest test, according to the Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. Technically, if it works as they claim, this missile could circle the globe at heights impossible for air defense systems to reach, and then swoop down without warning to deliver a nuclear strike practically anywhere on the planet, giving its target almost no time to prepare a defense. It could even have the potential to make the US's Golden Dome missile defense system redundant before it's even built. It's a tiny flying Chernobyl, according to Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear non-proliferation expert at Middlebury College. A bad development. It's one more science fiction weapon that is going to be destabilizing and hard to address in arms control. After Frank's interview, Lewis now has another sci-fi Russian weapon to worry about. On October 29th, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia had successfully tested the Poseidon nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable underwater drone, marking the first time it was launched from a submarine and operated using its onboard nuclear power unit. He described the test, conducted the previous day, as a huge success, claiming the weapon is unmatched in speed and depth and cannot be intercepted. There's nothing like this in the world in terms of speed and depth of movement. There is nothing comparable in the world and will hardly appear soon. There is no way to intercept it, Putin claimed. Unlike the Burevestnik, the Poseidon test has not been independently verified, and many Western observers were quick to disparage the whole story. With the humiliation of last week's failed big scary superweapon still fresh, Putin tries again, rolling out yet another superweapon to scare Western politicians that no longer care, Yain Kiev posted on X. Still, for NATO members with exposed coastlines, it might be worth taking the threat a little more seriously. If Poseidon is capable of what Putin says it is, Russia could sneak one off the coast of the UK, for example, leave it sitting there indefinitely. If a high-yield nuclear warhead were attached to it and it were detonated, say in the Thames River or near London, much of the UK would disappear under a radioactive tsunami before anyone had time to react. The same also applies to Belgium. A couple of well-placed Poseidons could turn the entire Benelux into a radioactive lake, while Mr. Francken is still reaching for his emergency kit. Some analysts have suggested that these moves have less to do with trying to intimidate the West into not supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles or other escalations, and more with trying to pressure Trump into accepting Putin's proposal to extend New START. It's the last remaining arms control treaty between the US and Russia, and it expires in February. In September, Putin offered to extend existing limits on the number of deployed long-range nuclear weapons for 1 year, provided that the United States did the same. Trump said the proposal sounds like a good idea to me. There's been no subsequent progress, much to Putin's chagrin. Moscow's overreaction to Francken's statements suggests that the mood inside the Kremlin is becoming increasingly tense. These new tests of advanced new weaponry suggest that relying on Putin to keep taking NATO escalations on the chin might be misguided. For ordinary Europeans, the threat of nuclear war keeps creeping closer. If NATO can wipe Moscow from the face of the earth, it's surely pure hubris at this stage to believe that much of Europe and the US won't face the same threat. Perhaps it's a good thing that the rational Mr. Francken has taken the time to try to calm things down. We'll of course keep you updated as the story develops, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop. And thank you, as always, for watching.